And what is going on, guys? And welcome back to the Pick Swap Media YouTube channel or the Fox Sports The Gambler airwaves. As my name is Sean Barnard, and I am filling in fully for Mark Henry Jr. on the Tough Cover Radio Show as well. But if you're hanging with me live, welcome and feel free to chime in on the comments. We have just concluded what is the best time in the NBA draft cycle for me, which is, of course, the NBA draft itself, which we have finally reached the conclusion of. A whole new crop of talents have found their homes at the NBA level, and it is going to be exciting to see what the breakdown is. So, in this episode, in today's show, I want to dive into a little bit of the best fits, some of the players that were the biggest surprise for what their location is for me, and a little bit of everything, and just kind of to set the record fully. This will be airing on Fox Sports The Gambler Saturday morning if you guys are listening on air there. So, we'll be taking a brief pause in the middle just to make sure that we can pay some, get the business taken care of and take care of things there. So just make sure to stay tuned throughout. But I want to begin by diving fully into this draft. So this has been talked about as one of the weakest class really in history there. And I understand that that is the case. And shout out to Jamal chiming in saying that we had a solid draft. Total agree. I think I'm really happy with what the Sixers did, and I'm going to dive into that. I'm going to set the stage a little bit, kind of speaking from the top. This draft, we're not going to remember as one of the greater classes of all time by any means. But what I do think that this draft is rich in is a lot of guys that will be high-level role players for the extended future. So I'm going to begin by taking a look a little bit at each of the guys that did go off the board and start right at the top, which we got to wander all the way out to the country of France to talk about who dominated this year's draft. Number one overall, Zachary Risacher. A little bit interesting here. This is a guy that I don't love the fit of, both just as a basketball player in general. I think his ceiling's pretty limited, and we kind of know exactly who he is as a basketball player. He's going to be a 3-and-D role player. He's going to be a guy who knocks down three-pointers at a relatively high clip. I know he shot the ball very well this year over in France, but a bit of an outlier. But to me, the bigger story here is that the Hawks got bullied out of taking the best player in this draft. And there was a lot of politics in this year's NBA draft class, I think more so than usual. And I will touch on the Bronny James talking point at the tail end of this because I do think it is relevant and certainly to this conversation. But at the number one pick, I think the best player pretty much universally was Alex Sarr. And that guy went number 2 to the Washington Wizards. Now, besides the fact that I do think it's strange that forcing yourself to the Washington Wizards is a decision that I would have never guessed in a million years, I just think the Hawks straight up didn't make the right pick, period. That I think if they were going to pick one, it's either Sarr or Donovan Clingan. I wouldn't have hated them going with Clingan from the standpoint of you know exactly who he is as a basketball player, probably more than any of the players that went before him. And for Risacher, who did go number one overall, he is very much that risk that, yes, he's a 3-and-D player. Yes, you can squint and think this is what he's going to be. But there is also a real world where the shot doesn't fall. And then what does he really do? But I do think he's a guy who's very shot dependent on what his impact will be. And I don't know if I'm as confident in that. He also shot the ball really poorly at the rim last year. He shot 37% at the rim. He did increase that number this year, but that is pretty frightening to me for a guy who has a skinny frame, does not do well under contact, and it's going to be a whole different beast at the NBA level. So a bit on the first two picks there. I don't love the Alex Sarr pick by Washington either. I get that this guy is hyped up, probably the most talented player, but he's still miles away from being a finished product. And if you were to compare him to a guy like Donovan Clingan, I also think Clingan is more of a sure bet. Now, I don't think Washington should have taken Clingan there. I understand taking the home run swing by bringing Alex Sarr. He does have the brother who's on the Oklahoma City Thunder. And when you dive into Sarr's kind of backstory and history, it is more frightening to me than I would like to admit. But this is a guy who sort of has taken the easy way out in a lot of situations, and he was never a guy who to take on top-level talent. That he's kind of ducked some smoke throughout the entirety of his basketball career, and that's no longer going to fly at the NBA level. Now, in his defense here, it's clearly worked, that he's put himself in a good spot and was drafted number 2 overall. So those are kind of the top 2 picks there. Where the draft, I think, really got interesting was a little bit after the fact, with the first American player off the board at number 3, that being Reed Sheppard of the Houston Rockets, and I love this pick here. So Reed Sheppard, an interesting player, a guy who went to Kentucky, a one-and-done player, was not one of the highest-ranked players at Kentucky. I believe he was 5th out of the recruiting class. They had guys like Justin Edwards, who, shout out, was brought to Philadelphia on a 2-way contract after going undrafted. I'm going to dive into him a little bit later. But Reed Sheppard ended up being a guy who outperformed expectations by the biggest margin. Shot 52% from beyond the three-point arc, which is freakish numbers there. Also some really good defensive indicators. Does a nice job sniffing out passing lanes, causing steals, getting in the mix for blocks, all these types of things. I do think he's a little bit overrated as a defender. I just think he's more of a gambler than I would like to be the case, that he's a guy who certainly is more prone to reaching in and getting the steal, trying to create the turnover, than actually sliding your feet and playing good defense. But he landed in Houston, which I think is a great spot for him. I think he's going to be groomed in that Fred VanVleet type of role, and ultimately, as a result, climb into that once Fred VanVleet does leave Houston, which I think will happen after this year. I believe is the last year on his contract. There might be one more, but the bottom line is kind of a short look outlook for Fred VanVleet as they reset things, and Reed Shepard is going to be the guy to carry the torch from there. Now moving on, Stephon Castle at number 4. Also very interesting pick to me. I've been a pretty anti-Stephon Castle guy. He is the guy that played for UConn this year, Donovan Clingan's teammate. The thing that rubbed me the wrong way about Stephon Castle is through the pre-draft process, he's made it crystal clear that he wants to be a point guard. And to be crystal clear right back at him, I just don't think you're a point guard. Now, if you want to dive all the way back to his high school tape, I did end up getting down a rabbit hole and watching him versus Ron Holland on the high school level, which honestly was awesome to watch. And what really did surprise me there is I did see a version of Stephon Castle who was incredibly ball dominant, who was a guy playing as primary point guard. And to call a spade, he straight up dominated Ron Holland. And I am a Ron Holland guy. This was a dude that I approached the draft hoping would be one of the fallers. And if he had fallen anywhere close to 16 or in that vicinity, I would have loved the Sixers to find a way to get his hands on it, because he is that type of high-level athlete, defender, and wing that they truly are lacking. And that is still an issue that has not been solved on the Sixers team. But ultimately, I did see Stephon Castle showing that he is capable of running a team, running an offense, and being that ball-dominant guy. Ultimately, I don't know if that's even going to be his role with the Spurs either. Now, Victor Wembanyama was obviously the centerpiece. It was very interesting to see what direction that they went. The Spurs started off the draft with 4 and 8, and 8 ultimately ended up being traded. But I was very excited to see what is their outlook for how do you build a contender. With Stephon Castle, he's a winning player. And I think that's the main category of what they're leaning into. Another concern that I had with Castle, he played in the dunker spot like a ton for UConn. Like that was one of the primary offensive sets that they ran with him at the dunker spot, which again, I just get to the point where if you're this like talented with the ball in your hand, you got to find ways to impact winning more so than just chilling around the basket. And he did show some flashes, does have decent touch, is a guy who doesn't have any true weaknesses in his game. I think ultimately that he's going to be a guy that probably has more in his bag than he was able to reveal in college. And I think San Antonio might be the spot for it, but I was a little surprised to see him go all the way up at 4. And I think this draft was full of surprises here. And the guy that I mentioned right behind him is Ron Holland at number 5. I did mention those two facing off at the high school level. Ron Holland was a guy who got a great amount of buzz for being a potential faller leading into this NBA draft. And ultimately, that proved not to be the case whatsoever. That Holland was a guy who deservingly so went in the top 5. He from day one is going to be an impactful defender, a guy that I think is going to be able to guard opposing teams' number 1 options on a night-to-night basis. He's 6'8", he's a freakish athlete, he's super physical, and he's electric in transition. That's probably the role for him for now. In the long run, there still is some star potential in him. He is a guy who's one of the top recruits in this overall class. Struggled on G League Ignite team, which just straight up underperformed to an extent. They went 2-32 on the season, which is pretty rough swing there. But when you look at that team, we're talking about Norris Cole being the guy who's running point guard for that team. And shout out to Norris Cole, who was an impactful player on those Miami Heat championship teams, but a little past your time at this point. So a little bit of an acknowledgement there. Shout out to Norris Cole. But for Ron Holland specifically, I think Detroit's a good spot for him. They obviously haven't quite figured out their identity. The bigger concern is they need to surround this team with shooting, and that's the opposite of what Ron Holland is. I am curious from the long-term perspective of what we're talking about. Cade Cunningham is a guy who I firmly have my eyes on, and if Detroit is not fully sold on Cade Cunningham being the guy moving forward, I don't know. I would absolutely jump on that from a Sixers perspective or really any team. As bad as the Pistons have been, I still think that he's a guy that, like, every time I watch, I believe in as a basketball player. And guys like Jaden Ivey also struggled. The Thompson twin also struggled as a shooter. So the Detroit that very much needs to bring in some sharpshooters. So Tobias Harris, come on down, is probably my guess for what happens there, even though I do not think that is fixed. Shout out to Mr. Crockpot, who was hanging out with me on day 1 of the draft. He's chiming in saying, Sean, please tell me on Adam Bona. Wasn't high on him, and I think he was a reach. So that being the Sixers second-round pick at the 41st overall selection there. I'm not the number 1 Adam Bona guy, but I have heard a ton of good things. The number 1 thing that jumped out, or what has been described to me at least, the highest motor of any player in the draft, that he is truly all over the page and pops. What it sells to me is this is a little bit of Paul Reed 2.0, And what that more means from the Sixers angle is that Paul Reed may no longer be here. And we know that he is on a non-guaranteed deal, a little over $7 million on the block there. I think the Sixers are very much going to look to shop Paul Reed, and whether it is traded, and that's something that when he is traded, a team can cut him for a little bit of financial relief, or ultimately the Sixers can just straight up cut him and take that cap relief themselves. We know this flexibility and versatility with all the cap space has been the selling point of the offseason. So I think Paul Reed's going to contribute to that there. We got Quentin chiming in saying bonus highlights really look good, but Twitter/X says he's not great. Yeah, I do think there's some IQ/ instinct questions. I think he kind of falls in the category of a player who does so much that sometimes he puts himself out of position, that sometimes he's just all over the floor. As far as if he's better than Paul Reed right now, I hate to say it, but I think probably not. I think he's got a lot of similar characteristics. He's a little bit bigger than Paul, much wider wingspan than Paul, at 7'4" wingspan there. And even Paul Reed, I guess, to answer your question, I don't think he is, and that is a concern there. I still think the Sixers need to bring in a backup center, but it's still the type of guy that I think is worth taking a swing on. It wouldn't have been my pick. Honestly, I was tweeting out that I would have taken Justin Edwards at 41, and, the Sixers landed him as an undrafted free agent. So I'm not going to be too caught up. To be perfectly clear, I think Edwards as an undrafted free agent is kind of the selling point and saving grace of today to me. So all is forgiven with the Bona pick, even if I don't love it completely. But we do got some love for him, calling him a Ben Wallace, sort of like Ben Wallace. I'll take that if that's what the Sixers end up with there. I think we're probably a couple years away from that being the case. But another guy that, by the way, has been spoken about in incredibly high light there. So I do want to dive a little bit more into the Sixers a little bit later, but I do want to touch on the draft a little deeper for the time. The guy that I would consider probably the second biggest reach of the draft would be Tajon Salon to 6 at Charlotte. Salon was definitely one of the biggest risers in this year's draft, a guy that I think falls into the theoretical basketball player category. It's tough to say with a lot of these international guys, and Salon's probably a guy that I just didn't pop to me the way I see some of the others, but I do like him. I just think 6th overall is a little bit high. Now, for number 7, Donovan Clingan, the guy that I think should have been in the conversation for being the number 1 pick overall. He is the most sure thing that you know exactly what Donovan Clingan is. He's a guy that's going to screen hard, going to catch lobs, going to be rim protect at an incredibly high level. What's interesting about Portland, though, is they're going to have some decisions to make as it pertains to DeAndre Ayton and Robert Williams. And Robert Williams is a guy, as we have this backup conversation, might be a notable option there from a trade piece. The Sixers are looking to get a certified guy that can play and play in the playoffs at a high level, by the way. Robert Williams is that guy. So I know the Time Lord has battled quite a few health issues there, but I do love his game. We got Brian Pumper chiming back in saying Bona has that cheating Jokic drop step, the hook shot move like that. Quentin saying the dunks, blocks, and elbows, LOL. Crockpot saying, I've read it. Adam Bona is a very poor man's Draymond Green. Interesting. I have not seen that take. And then Brian Pumper saying that I don't think Bona has the playmaking, though. Yeah, I don't think he's going to be a guy that you ever running offense through, or even like the dribble handoffs. I don't think is quite his bag. I think he's going to keep the game very simple, that it's catch lobs, set screens, and block shots. But you know what? If you can do that at a high level, you can make a pretty penny for yourself at the NBA level for big men there. So I'm not that worried from that standpoint. The first trade that we got in this year's NBA draft came at the number 8 pick, which are reasonably, and Mr. Crockpot saying that Bona's personal foul rate is astronomical. Can he play the Batman role that Embiid does? I also saw Kevin O'Connor tweeting out that he believes Bona and Embiid can share the floor together. I just don't see that whatsoever, to be perfectly honest. And I know we all pounded the table about Paul Reed potentially being it. I just don't know if I see that being the case. And there's 0 shooting in Bona right now. He doesn't have a jump shot whatsoever. Yeah, Brian's saying how he's an old school player. UCLA ran their offense through him in the post. Yeah, it's not going to fly at the NBA level. And that's not going to be, even if you're a Zach Edey level guy, you're just not going to get those kind of touches. But the first trade in this year's draft was Rob Dillingham here. He ultimately ended up out there in Minnesota with the Timberwolves, which I think is a really interesting pick there. They talked about how they saw the way that Kyrie Irving was such a dynamic scorer playing off Luka Doncic, that they want to replicate something similar with Anthony Edwards and Rob Dillingham. And obviously, all 4 players are very different in these conversations. Anthony Edwards is sure not Luka Doncic. You can maybe squint and talk yourself into Rob Dillingham having a little bit of Kyrie shades to him, but certainly Miles different as a player. And we still need Dillingham to put on some weight. That man is 165 pounds soaking wet, and we need to make sure that he can maintain, or his body at least can hold up to the NBA grind there. But I do like the Timberwolves taking that swing for the fences. It's important to me when you see a team have that kind of breakthrough in success. That Minnesota has been dancing around it for years, trying to get to that breakthrough period. And ultimately, they managed to make progress this year. You can't be satisfied with. I know Anthony Edwards, still young, getting better. As an organization, you got to back that up yourself and make sure that you're taking strides forward with them. And they did that by bringing Dillingham. So respect there. I don't fully love it from the Spurs direction, completely trading out of that pick. It does feel like the Spurs are being very calculated in their growth tactic. That we know Victor Wembanyama is the featured piece of that team, is the building block, the guy that everything is going to go around the timeline that it is set on. And it does feel like they're taking their time. That Stephon Castle will be a notable piece to add there. But I do think that I would have rather them have a third kind of trio piece. And even if it was like Rob Dillingham themselves, I think that would have been intriguing or something along those lines. Now, the most shocking pick of the draft, we have at number 9, Zach Edey to the Memphis Grizzlies. So for the Grizzlies specifically, there was a ton of buzz leading up about their desire to bring in Klingon. Klingon ultimately going off the board to the Trailblazers just 2 picks earlier. Seems like they just stuck with the concept of, you know what, we're sticking in, we're bringing in a big man. We know that's what we need, and even if it's not quite our guy, we're sticking with the thought process here. Now, the Zach Edey conversation is an interesting one, and to jump into the full kind of scale of it, I was very much a Zach Edey skeptic until this season. And this season, he proved a little bit to me that he showed a little bit more mobility on the perimeter, just showed a little bit of steps forward, and just the way that he moves, the way that his lateral movement, he's never going to be a guy that we're thinking is switchable on the perimeter or anything like that. But I do think in certain schemes, you can find a way to use this guy. There's enough there from an offensive standpoint that, yes, he is a post scorer. Yes, he's a guy who's a physical bruising talent. But he also can just straight up score the basketball. That he's a guy that you dump it into him a couple times, and he's going to be effective with those touches. And there is some true touch in his hands. Like, he's not just a bruiser. Shot the ball really well at the free throw line. Got those numbers near 80%, which is really impressive for a big man. We typically do not see that there. So I think there's enough there with Edey. And another point to note is that Nick Nurse was coaching him for Team Canada and spoke really highly about him, about his competitiveness, about all these types of things. So I do think that speaks to Edey as a whole, and something that got me to buy in a little. I'm also very glad he was off the board by 16, because I just did not even want to think about that from the Sixers perspective, but very curious there. We got a couple more comments on Bona here. Brian Pumper chiming back in saying, I'm telling you, Bona plays way tougher than B-Ball, kind of a more explosive Aaron Gordon. I see what Morey saw. All right, I like that. And then he's saying Spurs don't want to be too good. They see that 2025 draft. That is a great point there. They may be playing the long game there. Shout out to Prince for chopping it up and checking in. And Crockpot saying that I low-key like the Blazers draft. They had Klingon fall in their laps, and they did an epic trade in nabbing Advia. Yeah, the Denny Advia trade I absolutely love from the Blazers perspective. That's going to be a trade that ages incredibly well. I do think Advia is that next kind of category of player who's just made to contribute to winning teams. That he's only going to be making 11 mil in 2028, which I just wanted that on the Sixers. But the other Sixers perspective here is like, until you figure out who your third star is, if that is Brandon Ingram or Jimmy Butler or Paul George or whoever that option is, which you got to get an option, you got to give me something here. Whoever your complementary pieces are, kind of changing what you're looking for. So you got to figure out what that is, set the first plan in order, and let's build a team out from there. But I am a little more optimistic in my Sixers lenses than a couple days ago. Shout out to Jared McCain for helping that one out. Now, to round out the top 10, the final pick here, Cody Williams going out there to Utah. I'm not a Cody Williams guy. I've been very skeptical of him. I know me and Mark Henry Jr. have gone head-to-head on quite a bit of the Cody Williams takes here. I could end up being ultimately wrong. I don't hate it for Utah's setting, that I do think they can afford to let him play through his mistakes in a way that's going to be necessary to his growth. But I'm just skeptical of him being capable of creating advantages on the offensive end. He's the ultimate theoretical basketball player to me, that he has all the tools. He has all the what you're looking for or what you think of in a basketball player, but it just doesn't flow together. And my honest takeaway, the number one like red flag to me, is every time I watched him play, it felt like his processing of the game in front of him was just too slow. And that's only going to get worse at the NBA level. That like the game moves at an entirely different pace. And that's going to be something where, you got to keep up if you're Cody Williams. And I'm not sure if that is the case there. Appreciate all the comments coming in. And Mr. Crockpot coming back saying, Ken Maxey, KCP, Ingram, Jeremy Grant, Embiid with McCain off the bench get this team to the finals. I don't think so. My short answer there. I've even soured a little more after talking about it a little bit on stream during night one of the draft, looking into Jeremy Grant. I just can't get behind it. That Jeremy Grant, like, not even just like a below average defender, like incredibly bad defender. Like straight up, Jared McCain will be a better defender than Jeremy Grant, which is frightening in itself. And whoever the Sixers do nab for that power forward slot, I think it at least has to be competent as a rebounding option. Because I've said this plenty of times about Joel Embiid. He's obviously an electric talent, a guy that is so good at the things that he is good at, but he's not a great rebounder. He happens to be 7'2". He happens to play around the basket as often as he does that he ending up with enough rebounding for the numbers to look fine, but he's certainly not a guy that has a skill as a rebounder. Like you watch the guys who truly are good rebounders, who can read it off the rim, feel the bounce, all these types of things. That's not Joel Embiid. So adding a guy that as a forward that can help with that, and particularly after this team just got beat up by the Knicks in the playoffs, I think they absolutely have to do that. So Jeremy Grant does not fill that role for me. I'm kind of out on the Jeremy Grant experience for that specific reason. As I mentioned, this is going up on the Fox Sports The Gambler on Saturday for the Tough Cover Radio Show. I'm going to keep plugging through immediately after this, but I'm going to hit a quick pause and mark the time real quick just to make sure we can get to our commercial break there. So let me hit the note down the time. We're going to head to break. I'll be right back after this. All right, and welcome back on the other side to all my radio listeners. For everyone else hanging straight through, appreciate you. And I love all the comments coming in. Prince Monito chiming back in saying, got to get Murray, and all the other role players were falling into place. DeJounte Murray is a name that I don't think enough attention has been paid to. And by the way, the contract looking much friendlier on DeJounte Murray. Like if we're talking about a Tyrese Maxey, DeJounte Murray, Brandon Ingram, and then Joel Embiid and whoever you want to do is the four, that can even be Oubre or Batum. I can live with that particular situation, although you need another rebounding reinforcement for sure there. I think DeJounte Murray is worth a name that should be talked about a little bit more. Jamal chiming in saying we need to grab some of these pieces from the Nets. That is definitely something worth paying attention to. Dorian Finney-Smith is a guy that I certainly have my eyes on. I wish Cam Johnson made less money. He's over $20 million a year. I think 23 is the number there. That's a lot for Cam Johnson in my mind. So very much a little bit skeptical of that being a fit for this Sixers team. But who knows? If the price is right and you strike out on all the others, that would be the type of price point which you could potentially flip. Brian Bumper saying the Kyle Filipowski story is wild, straight up movie. Yeah, for anyone who has not heard this a little bit, I would recommend a Google search to get the full details. But the bullet point short version is, I'll start off by saying I was very caught off guard. I came in with a hot take saying Kyle Filipowski would fall out of the first round completely. Did believe that to be the case. It ultimately did. Then reading up on a bunch of wire reporters saying that there's some concerns about his girlfriend. And I just sent a tweet out being like, why would that impact his draft stock whatsoever? Like his girlfriend immediately got some tweets back, fill me in, about how she was a 26-year-old when he was still in high school, and that former babysitter who allegedly groomed her, and now he's completely not connected to his family, doesn't communicate with him. Both Filipowski's brother and mother have kind of sounded off about it online. So a lot of stuff to dig into. And my last point that I'll just slip in, thank goodness he got drafted by the Utah Jazz. Because, if this is what's going on, at least it's in a place where it may be looked on a little bit more positively than just about any other place in the country there. Prince Monito chiming in saying, looking forward to watching these new pickups in Summer League and Rico Hines. A lot of tape to watch, should be very fun. I do think the Sixers ended up with some really intriguing players that will shine in the Summer League. A guy like Justin Edwards, I've spoken really highly about. He is a local Philly area guy, the third overall recruit. The guy that was the top recruit on Kentucky was outshined by the Rob Dillinghams and the Reed Shepherds of the world there. But ultimately, the pedigree is still there, and I do think he has a game that translates best to the NBA level more so than college. So I'm a Justin Edwards believer. I do think there's a world where his NBA career turns out just fine. I kind of dove into a lot of the scouting reports. There's a lot of concern with the right hand. He is a lefty shooter and a guy that's much more comfortable driving left. The right seemed to be really shaky. And a couple just kind of concerns on like the overall polish, the decision making, the assists, the playmaking weren't there really at all. He was a streaky shooter. I think ultimately the reality is you got to accept this guy. This guy doesn't have quite the superstar potential that was once thought, but I do think he very well could turn into like a legitimate 3-and-D role player in a way that like sticks around in the NBA for quite an extended period of time. So if that is the case for Justin Edwards, that is a home run pick for an undrafted free agent. And I also, while I haven't been able to confirm this anywhere, I'm of the mindset and belief that he probably requested to go undrafted, that this was a situation where he didn't want to fall into a bad situation in the second round where he's in a tough spot. I think it's probably pretty likely his agent pulled the phones and said we would prefer going undrafted and picking our location. And the Sixers is a great spot to go for him. Not only is it local in Philadelphia, but he's also a guy that is coming to a roster with no sense of certainty right now. Like the Sixers obviously are going to fill out the rest of the roster, that there's plenty of cap space and things to go into that. But say Justin Edwards absolutely shines in Summer League, there is a world where Daryl Morey looks at that and considers maybe we upgrade this guy to a standard contract. Like that is the type of opportunity that's in front of him. But it's on him to dog it out and prove that what he can bring to the table. Now, to dive back into the first round of this draft a little bit more, I mentioned Zach Edey at 9, mentioned Cody Williams at 10. At 11, Matas Buzelis to the Chicago Bulls might be my biggest steal of the draft. I'm a big Matas Buzelis guy. I do think that there's a real world where when we look back on this draft class several years down the line, that he's the most talented player or most productive player. I do think he's got real deal all-star potential. It's also very cool to me. He is a Chicago kid. Both his parents played professionally overseas originally, that they moved to Chicago, and he has lived his entire life there. That is really cool to me that he gets to play in front of the hometown fans. And as I mentioned, I think the dude can straight up get buckets, that I think Matas can play. I do think that he's going to surprise some people with how impactful he is. And for the Chicago Bulls specifically, that's the type of upside swing that you should be looking to take. That Buzelis having the ability to grow into a better player. The Bulls are in such no man's land for what their direction is as an organization, that I think taking a potential superstar swing, which is the case with Matas, is the right direction to go. And he's another guy with the G League Ignite. I mentioned with Ron Holland, they went just 2-32 this year across all professional games. They really were a mess, and that's the primary reason why the organization has been, pulled the plug on moving forward. Now, that doesn't help them at all in this specific situation, but I do think that, the bottom line is talent is still talent. Both Matas and Ron Holland were guys that were ranked incredibly highly in the recruiting circles. You don't just lose your basketball touch overnight. So I do think that there is a world where Matas Buzelis outperforms his draft slot by a pretty significant margin and ends up a lot of people passing on him right there. Now, a little deeper here, number 12, Nikola Topic, an interesting pick by the Oklahoma City Thunder here. The Thunder have a vast amount of riches when it comes to assets and draft picks and what they can do with it. I'm not a Nikola Topic guy, that I do think the shooting are legitimate concerns. I think the ACL is really an issue there. This is going to be almost a draft and stash type situation, that I don't think he's going to be stepping on the floor for the entirety of the year. I think the Thunder probably look at that as just a fine thing. He certainly can fill a little bit of that Zach Giddey role from the on-ball standpoint, but I think the Thunder were relieved to get rid of the real Zach Giddey rule, who essentially played himself out of the off the court in the playoffs by not being able to shoot. And Topic has some similar concerns there. So he is big. He is a project. In the long run, he may end up being a just fine player, but I didn't love this pick for the Thunder. I think they could have gone in a lot of different directions there. That's probably my least favorite pick. Even the Edey pick is one that I can kind of see the logic behind it. I don't love it with Topic whatsoever here. Moving beyond, we're going back to a pick that I do like quite a bit, which is Devin Carter at 13 to the Kings. And before I jump into that, we got a couple more comments to jump into. We got Mr. Crockpot saying, DeJounte, McCain, Maxey, and KCP, sign me up. Yep, shooting. And I do want to dive a little deeper into that conversation when I get to McCain here. Prince Modena saying that a lot of shooters to complement them. I'm interested to see who these new backup bigs are. Also, a fun fact here, Jared McCain and Desmond Bane had very similar stats out of college. We love the Buddy Hield edition, but Nick Nurse didn't really optimize them. Does that change with McCain? And the other guy that I would say look up from a statistical standpoint, I saw some Devin Booker and Jared McCain similarities from their college stats. I believe it was the per 100 possession numbers that were being looked at that were pretty close to identical there. But I don't think he's Devin Booker, but I would love to be wrong about that if he's like that. And the other thing with all these size concerns, like what if this guy just grows 2 more inches and we're talking about Jared McCain being 6'5" or 6'6"? A lot of issues are solved in a significant way. So to answer the question, Sixers fan, how am I feeling? Feeling pretty good about the Sixers right now. Certainly better than yesterday, although far more work is to be done. Saying, I don't know much about the big guy if we got from UCLA. How do I like him? Don't love him. I think to me it spells the writing on the wall. The writing is on the wall for B-Ball Paul that he will not be back next year. I think he's very B-Ball Paul 2.0. He's all athleticism, all hustle, all energy. Those aren't the worst things in the world. He's a guy who I do think wants it. I think he's worth taking a flyer on, but wouldn't have been the direction I went by any means there. To keep lugging along here, jump right into the next pick. I did mention Devin Carter at 13 to the Kings. Particularly what I liked about the Devin Carter pick is we saw how impactful it was for that Kings team to have Keon Ellis as an option in the backcourt. When you have a team constructed with De'Aaron Fox, who's a passable defender, with Domantas Sabonis, who's always going to be a below average defender, it is important to have these wings and these guards who are physical, in your face, imposing to opposing teams. Keon Ellis fit that build. And I think Devin Carter is just like a more evolved version of Keon Ellis, that I do think he's going to be a guy getting in the grill, causing issues, going to be rebounding at a high level, which is also helpful around Sabonis, although his rebounding numbers are off the charts as well. It gives just a lot of flexibility for this Kings team. And that attitude, that grittiness is something I think that team needs. So I'm very excited for Devin Carter. That's up there among my favorite picks and fits across this entire draft. At 14, a little bit of a reach here, I feel. Bub Carrington. I like Bub Carrington quite a bit. I did feel like 14 was a little bit high for him. And Bub's probably the guy that was the biggest riser in the draft process, as far as from where the pre-draft process started, where guys were pegged and where they ended up. Bubba was a guy that was looking like a fringe first-round pick. He ultimately went 14, very much clearly in the lottery, and there is quite a bit of long-term potential for him. One of the youngest players in the draft, I believe the youngest, that he's 18 years old. He's 6'5", still growing. I like Bub's game. I do think there's a world where, he's going to be very good, and I think it could happen shorter rather than longer. The number one thing that really appealed to me, he ran a ton of pick and rolls at Pitt. We're talking about 12.6 pick and roll opportunities per game, which is pretty nutty at the college level, and scored at near 1.1 points per possession on those opportunities there. That's over the 90th percentile in college. If you can run pick and roll at that high of level in college, there's a place for you in the NBA. And I do think Bub could be capable enough as a shooter in the long run. He was a chucker at Pitt. I think when the shot selection is cleaned up, I think that will settle down a great deal of the efficiency there. So Bub Carrington at 14. Then at 15, we get Khalil Ware to the Miami Heat. And this was a nice little pump fake moment, as when watching on stream with Mr. Crockpot and everybody else, we get the tweet from Jake Fisher saying the Miami Heat are selecting Jared McCain. Now, we were all jumping for joy, thinking that we get Dalton Connect, but all of a sudden, psych, they're taking Khalil Ware. This was an interesting pick for me. So probably from the Heat perspective, I do think he fits a little bit of the Heat culture vision. Like, that's kind of the vibe, the style that he does give off there. But even more than that, what it really told me is that they're going to try and make this work with another big man and Bam. And I do see a world where Khalil Ware and Bam Adebayo can absolutely play together. We did see late in last season a little bit of growth in Bam Adebayo's perimeter shooting, him being capable of knocking it down from beyond the arc, but that really has not been his calling card. That throughout the entirety of his NBA career, that's essentially been a zero, that he just has not done that. He's a mid-range, around-the-rim guy, does plenty of good on other areas. Defensively, he's unbelievably good. As a playmaker, really good for a big man. But what Khalil Ware can be, I think the best version of him is more or less as a pick and pop, floor spacing big man who can still shot block. He shot over 40% from three last year on some pretty fair sample size. Would like to see a little more to truly believe it, but I do think that that is something that they're buying into. And the other part that I do respect about Ware is he completely rewrote the novel or the book about himself. That when you flash back to his first season at Oregon, this guy was basically talked about as no longer has a future in the NBA. The motor isn't there. The effort isn't there. And then he rewrote everything about him by performing at a high level with Indiana. So shout out to Khalil Ware. I do like the comeback story. It does suck that it is going to happen down in Miami there. But that did pave the way for our Philadelphia 76ers to hop on the clock at 16, in which they ended up with Jared McCain out of Duke. So I want to jump into a couple of these comments here. I see we're all jumping in. We'll start right here with Quentin, who says, does McCain have an inside the arc game? Yeah, he absolutely does there. Oh, and even to add to it, we got a 63% from Mr. Crockpot. Love these stats that are jumping in here. Sixers fan 229 saying, can't believe we passed up on Connect from Tennessee. That dude is going to be a star, another Sixers L. So we talked about this a lot in the moment when it happened. And I won't lie to you that if I was on the stand, if I was making that decision at that point in time, I was ready to pull the trigger on Dalton Connect being the next Sixers player. Now, to zoom out, now that I've kind of processed it and everything, this does say a lot to me about the Sixers' direction. For starters, Jared McCain's the higher ceiling for sure. That I think for a guy that's 20 years old, still growing, has kind of a higher pedigree. Don't forget Dalton Connect. This was a dude who started his career in JUCO, spent 2 years there, then transferred to Northern Colorado, spent 2 years there where he wasn't even a real factor his first year. He was an 8-point per game scorer. Then he ballooned up to a 20-point per game score in his second year, again, in Northern Colorado. We're talking in the Big Sky Conference right now. And then he transferred, hit the transfer portal after almost hanging up the basketball sneakers for life. Got a little nibble from Tennessee, and then turned into their best player. Took his game to a whole nother level. I like Dalton Connect. I think he's a better athlete than he gets credit. I think there's absolutely a place in the NBA for him. But when I'm kind of mocking what his future is, I think he's more cut from like, it's a little disrespectful to say the Duncan Robinson and JJ Redick type archetype. I think he can be a little more than that, but not by that much. Like straight up, if we're calling who's a better defender, I think Jared McCain's a better defender than Connect right now. Like Connect was essentially a cone for Tennessee, and they didn't have a lot of guys behind him that were good. That was a huge problem with the Tennessee team, and you don't blame him because he had to carry such a heavy load offensively. But I do think he's going to be a guy that is circled at the NBA level. I think has less of a chance than holding up than McCain. Now, there's two other notable things that this told me. Number one, there's still a very realistic chance in my mind that Jared McCain is traded from the Sixers team, that he never suits up or plays a game for them. If there is this blockbuster deal, players sometimes are more valuable than picks, and every team has their own perception there. But if the Sixers are sitting back thinking there's a possibility that we need to repackage this, what's more appealing? Is it Jared McCain or is it Dalton Connect? Dalton Connect on certain teams is ready to be a win now impact player. I think that's his role at the NBA, is he's going to be in the mix, ready to play minutes, being a win now piece. Jared McCain is more universally beloved or appealing, that you can kind of sell him to a rebuilding young team, that he could be a potential building block or at least a culture setting guy. You also can still add him to the win now teams, that I think he's that good and ready to perform at the moment, which is my expectation with the Sixers. I also think it told us a little bit about the vision for the Sixers team, that we live in an era of wings, that you look around at what teams are having success. The Boston Celtics with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown just won a championship. Look at the New York Knicks. You see how heavily they're leaning into having OG Anunoby, having Mikal Bridges here. The Sixers have to find a way to beat these teams. And if we're calling a spade, it's probably not in getting better wings than them. That I just don't see a world where they can go out in the market and get those teams or get those players that are better. So when you think about how can you find ways to beat this team, you got to find other routes. Now, the core of this is obviously the Sixers have Joel Embiid. They have the best big man in basketball when he's healthy. Still believe that, even with Nikola Jokic and the success that he has had. And then when you're surrounding him with talent, it's shooters. I think that's the direction the Sixers are leaning in. That it's going to be Joel Embiid and floor spacers. That's why I do think they ultimately go out there and sign Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. That's why I do think the vision is going to be we give the ball to Joel Embiid in one-on-one, and then we force the decision of opponents. You either double down on him and create open three-point looks for other guys, or you leave him in one-on-one coverage, and then Joel Embiid leads the league in scoring for the third time in his career. I think that's a little bit of the vision that Jared McCain, at the end of the day, there's other things I like about him. I think his rebounding underrated. I think he's a better defender than he's getting credit. But as a shooter, that's going to be his defining trait there. I'm going to jump into a couple more comments here. Mr. Crockbot saying, working on this video and the sample size is small, but McCain averaged 1.15 points per possession, 96th percentile in the pick and roll. Really good stuff there. And what's even cooler to me is McCain spoke following the draft, talking about how the pick and roll reads is one of the things that he wants to prove. He really was not asked to do it a lot at Duke. I saw some criticism for the lack of assists, and I do get that. I think he's a better playmaker than the numbers indicate, but he really wasn't asked to be much of an on-ball threat at Duke. We will see much more of what he's truly made of at the summer league setting. But I will say I've heard a lot about like him being essentially like a leader of men type point guard, that he does a really good feel for getting other guys involved. So we'll see how that all shakes out. We got a comment saying the dude McCain got to be trolling on TikTok. Yeah, they are something. But you know what? If you're shooting 40% from three, I don't care how much you want to dance is kind of my outlook there. And Crockbot on the same page with me saying all the haters will immediately shut up when Embiid and Maxey dance with McCain on TikTok. Of all these young kids, all these things young kids can do, this is a nothing story. Dance, young man, dance. Yeah, that's where I'm at. Don't forget, we're a year removed from Brandon Miller having questions about, bringing a weapon to a murder scene. We've talked about, some police interactions with other prospects, with drug situation. If TikTok is our biggest worry, I can live with that with Jared McCain is pretty much where my head is at there. So I'm absolutely okay with that. Brian, a little more skeptical, is saying, Sean, I believe we're in a secret rebuild, man. Sticking and picking is not what contenders do. Watch this Sunday's disappoint. So my, I guess, pushback here is I think McCain is one of those have your cake and eat it too situations where he can absolutely be repackaged in a trade if they are trying to make a win now trade, which should still be the intention, even if, free agency doesn't come together or whatever. But I do think that this is a situation in which you're bringing in a young prospect with the hopes that he develops, but at the same time, if he is a trade chip, that is okay. So I think that was a large part of the calculus for why McCain was the decision over Connect. Also, who is the better defender? Rob Dillingham, Reed Shepherd versus Rob Dillingham versus Jared McCain. absolutely not Rob Dillingham. He's certainly third in that list. Reed Shepard's a guy I consider a theoretical defender, that he's a little bit of a steals and blocks merchant, that he's a gambler, wants to let the defender get in front of him, poke it out, and all this kind of stuff. Beyond that, this is like Jared McCain's a guy that I think is more of a slide your feet, move your hips, and actually guard a guy. So Jared McCain would be my answer, but I think it's pretty comfortably McCain, Shepard, Dillingham for that question there. A lot of comments about the TikToks, which I do appreciate there. Uh, for as far as like the TikTok conversations as a whole, I think there's a part of it that's a little bit charming to me. It's obviously weird. Obviously, not everyone's cup of tea for it, but it's also like the dude just doesn't care. And I kind of respect that he's just doing Jared McCain things. And I do appreciate that. And also, there's kind of this angle of, for starters, him and Maxey going to have very similar vibes. Maxey's obviously not quite as like, out there as we're seeing with Jared McCain. But I do think that similar, just energetic, positive vibes is what they bring about. And for too many years now, we've seen Joel Embiid kind of be miserable on the court. That I like that there's like this youth movement, this up-tempo vibe, this energy. I think that could go away towards rebuilding like his joy for the game in a way. So I'm very excited about that from Joel Embiid's perspective. I do hope that is the case. And I'll also note this little nugget from me that I kind of pieced together here. If you take a look at the Sixers initial tweet, the FaceTime that was showing Jared McCain talking to Nick Nurse and Daryl Morey through the phone, you hear Joel Embiid's voice at the tail end there. So my read between the lines is that Joel Embiid was straight up in the war room and a part of that. So at the minimum, I think he signed off and approved of it. I think that's kind of cool that Joel Embiid's that involved in the process overall. So we'll see what that's overall going down there. We get another comment here. Jared McCain, a different type of cat. He has like 4 journals he keeps and does yoga at 20. You know what, man? I'm at the same spot of, if you can pour in the rock 40% plus from beyond the 3-point arc, give a nice scoring punch off the bench and play good basketball, that's all I care about at this point. So we'll put a little bow on the Jared McCain conversation right now. But to keep going in the draft, at 17, the guy that most people I think wanted was Dalton Knecht. A guy that, like, and by the way, I did hear the report of JJ Redick drawing up plays for Knecht on his notebook immediately after the pick was made, which the JJ Redick stuff is going to be intolerable this year, man. So there's going to be a lot of that. But I do think Knecht is a great piece for that Lakers team. He reminds me, and like this guy got cut, so it's kind of disrespectful, but remember Matt Ryan on that Lakers team, how effective he was for a short period of time? I could see Dalton Knecht being that and a little more on that Lakers team. He's a guy that, like, again, I think his ceiling's a little more limited than people are giving credit. He is 23, and that Lakers team is just going to be a circus this year. I'll get to the Bronny James conversation, but for LeBron, you got your podcast co-host as your head coach, and you got your son running point. I can't imagine this team is taking winning that seriously with those conditions here. But moving on, Tristan da Silva, my guy at 18. I love this pick for the Magic. I just love Tristan da Silva. I think he's going to be a winning player regardless of where he ended up. He just does a little bit of everything in a way that I think is really effective and important and can translate to whatever team that he is on there. So the Magic are a team that doesn't fully know what they're doing or what the direction. They certainly have taken strides forward, but I still have some questions about who's the actual part of their long-term core. Do they have to? Is there going to be a return of Franz Wagner shooting? Is Paolo Banchero truly this all-star caliber guy? I do lean toward yes on that answer there. A little bit more skeptical of Franz. I do have some concerns after being a real deal Franz guy for a period of time. Prince chiming in saying, damn, man, for the Magic get Tristan. That's dope. Yeah, I'm excited about that. I will be a Tristan da Silva fan. I don't know why his game stood out to me so much in the pre-draft process, but I very much would have loved to see him in a Sixers uniform. And like I said, I do think that he's going to be a guy that impacts winning at a high level regardless of what team he is. I saw some concerns. He's definitely a prospect which, like, the ceiling and floor are not that far off. You basically know exactly what he is. But what I view that is like a 5th starter on a winning team for the entirety of his career. And you could do far worse than that, especially at the 18th pick there. To keep it going down the line here, number 19, we got Jacoby Walter. I'm not a Jacoby Walter guy. Him in Toronto, he can play through his mistakes a little bit there. I'm curious what Toronto's full direction is. I know they're trying to trade Bruce Brown right now, probably add a couple pieces. They do have Emmanuel Quickly and RJ Barrett as kind of their launching point for that. So we'll see how that shakes out. But I think Walter is going to be a guy who's going to be a shot chucker for a long time. He's just not quite good enough at it in my mind. I know he shot below 40% from 3, below 40% from the field overall this year. I think it was 32% and 36% from 3. I want to say offhand, or 32% from 3, 36% from the field. I believe offhand. yeah, that's not a shooter to me. That I know that's the book on him. He could have shot poorly, and there were some like spacing and other issues with that Baylor team, but I just didn't quite see it with with Jacoby Walter. So a little bit curious there. So we're at the 45-minute mark here. For the radio listeners, I'm going to take a quick pause again. We'll be back on the other side talking about the rest of the NBA draft and the Sixers. For everyone else, I'll be right back with you, but talk to you soon. And to pick things up on the other side here, I do want to continue on with a lot of the draft talk. We got a couple more comments chiming in. Shout out to everybody hanging. Mr. Crockpot saying when JJ Redick was asked why Jared McCain is a better prospect than Dalton Neck. Funny comment there. I do think like the discourse will be lost a little bit. I understand both ways. I think the Sixers, frankly, the board looks far better with having the options of both Connect and McCain, but I'm pretty satisfied with Jared McCain being a part of this team. Nick Curcio chiming in saying, I don't want to hear anything about Bona. Thank you. Thank you for all you've done, Paul Reed. It's been an amazing ride. I do think this is the end of the Paul Reed experience, unfortunately. But I do think there may be greener pastures out there for Paul Reed with a team that's a little more willing to live with the mistakes that he does bring on. So we will see what goes on there. But to keep it going with this draft, Mark Henry Jr.'s guy, Jalen Tyson, coming off the board at number 20 there to the Cleveland Cavs. I like Jalen Tyson. Mark was really bullheaded in this guy that he thought for sure that he was a lottery pick, that he was all in on Jalen Tyson from the beginning. I didn't have a clear answer for him why he shouldn't be. That for a large part of this, Mark would just hit me with a question of why isn't Jalen Tyson a lottery pick? And I didn't have a great answer for him. I do think it's notable that he moved from 3 different teams. I know Texas Tech was one of them. I believe Texas was the other. And then he ended his career at Cal. Played a different role at each of these teams. So a little bit surprising there. The Cavs is an interesting spot for them. I would have liked to lean them into even more shooting. I know they went that direction by adding Max Strus and Georges Niang last year. I do think that they still need help in that direction. Guys like Isaac Okoro have not played themselves out as like their 3-and-D style players they're hoping. So I think Tyson, they're hoping is that direction, but we will see if that's actually the case there. So moving on beyond 20. 21, we have Yves Missy out of Baylor to the New Orleans Pelicans. This was my biggest fear from the Sixers' perspective, that they were going to pull the trigger on Missy. There was a lot of smoke, both coming from Missy's camp and Missy's mouth specifically, as well as from just other reporters kind of connecting those dots. Missy was one of the rare prospects that did work out for the Sixers. Sixers and Daryl Morey spoke about this after, try to be a quote-unquote black box of things where no teams know what they're doing. Don't think they do a particularly excellent job of that. It's gotten better during the Daryl Morey era, but in general, that has not been a strong characteristic of this organization there. But ultimately, nobody did see the interest in Jared McCain officially, even though there were some mocks there. So I guess the job done. But that did leave for Yves Missy to go to New Orleans. They will be losing Jonas Valanciunas most likely in free agency this year. So this is going to be a guy that I think has a chance to earn his role pretty quickly. New Orleans has some real deal conversations, needing to look in the mirror and figure out their identity as a team as well. I know Brandon Ingram's a large part of that and impacts the Sixers for how those conversations are dictated overall. So I do hope there's a positive outcome, but Missy has a pretty blank slate and a chance to really prove himself. I think that's a good spot for him there. Then we move to 22, the Phoenix Suns, which this pick was traded ultimately to the Denver Nuggets. Deron Holmes, the second here. Holmes is going to be awesome, man. He's going to be great in Denver. Nikola Jokic is going to have him looking like a stud. And he's even a little bit like as great of an athlete as Aaron Gordon is. I think Deron Holmes is more of like a high flyer athlete than Aaron Gordon is. Now, Gordon obviously has some skills. They even play Gordon as like the ball handler. They did that more last year, way more than they did in the championship year. So it will be interesting how all these pieces come together, but I do think that's a good spot for Holmes there. And I do like him as a talent overall. And I do love this comment from Brian Pumper as well, saying, forget BI. New Orleans needs to send us Trey Murphy. I would love Trey Murphy. I would absolutely love that. I do think that's the discussion point in the New Orleans camp, that I do think that they basically are going with Trey Murphy over Brandon Ingram, which I can kind of get to an extent. He's a volume shooter. He's a high flyer. Trey Murphy absolutely rocks, man. I'm all in on that. I would love if that was a possibility, but I do think that unfortunately is probably not going to be the case there. I think they're pretty dead set on bringing him. Mr. Crockpot saying he'd be all the way back in if that was me as well. That I would love nothing more than see Trey Murphy in a Sixers uniform, but I do think that's a pipe dream there. Now, another name that is in the conversation for the biggest reaches of the entire draft is AJ Johnson to the Bucks at 23. If you're picking for 5 years down the line, you might have an argument. But if we're talking about this year, I just don't see where which AJ Johnson can play on the NBA floor. He's intriguing. He's an NBL guy. I believe he played for the Illawarra Hawks over there, same team that LaMelo played for a year. He's got some intriguing like raw trades. I just think this is a guy that's going to need like pretty significant G League time before we're looking at anything significant there. And Prince Modito asking if GM Giannis is happy with his pick. I can't imagine that he is there. So I'll brush over to AJ Johnson. I don't want to be too hard on the guy, but I don't like that pick whatsoever there. Then we went to back-to-back picks. I believe the Knicks, they did trade out this 24th pick. Kaishan George there. A guy that I like Kaishan George, but he's 2 years away from being ready in my mind. That's what kind of left me off the Sixers hype for him. You see the traits, you can see it. He's just very raw. Another one of the guys, one of the youngest in the class there. And another very young talent that the Knicks did hold on to, which I hate, Pacomai Dadier is, I believe, how you say it. Very good player. I like him. He did not play a lot, played very limited minutes on a professional team, but he's explosive. He's a good cutter. The cutting has been something that has jumped out to the page to me more and more lately, and he does fit that category of a player who's high IQ, moving off ball. I hope it very much pains me that seemingly overnight the Knicks have turned into an organization which just knows how to run a basketball team. And here in Philadelphia, we're still struggling on those same situations. So welcome to the United States, Pacome. Welcome to New York. Then at 26, Dylan Jones to the Wizards here. This one is tough. That I do hate that Dylan Jones ultimately is the case. Seeing some comments from Mr. Crockpot on the same page as me saying, I hate the Wizards pick of Dylan Jones. Would have loved that guy on the Sixers. Yeah, we talked about him in our second round prospects profile and guys, the draft that we did there. I like Dylan Jones, the pride of Weber State, a guy who just a physically bruising, a guy that like looks big. He's like Raymond Felton size in the way that he is rounded, and he uses every inch of that body that he does got. He wants to put his shoulder down. He wants to bump into you, and he's averaged over 10 rebounds a game for 2 of the 4 seasons in college. I think he ended at 9.6 this year. Also a really good playmaker, a guy that's a good decision maker. I can't believe he snuck into the first round, but he is a guy that I like quite a bit. So shout out to Washington for stepping up and nabbing him there. Then at 27, another guy I think should be in the conversation for one of the bigger steals, Terrence Shannon Jr. out of Illinois. So there was obviously the legal situation that played out. He was suspended for a brief period of time for some pretty serious accusations. That all was ultimately cleared up, and that it does like that there is no longer any sort of case to worry about with that type of thing. He is free to play basketball and ultimately on the floor flourish this year. The number one thing that jumps out to me about Terrence Shannon Jr. is the physicality with the way that he plays, that he wants contact when he attacks the rim. Shot over 8 free throw attempts per game this year, which is a really high figure, especially at the college level there. He's a guy who is a combo guard. I think he's always going to be more of a score first guy, but he can rebound a little bit. He can play make a little bit. I like Terrence Shannon Jr. It's going to be interesting to see him and Rob Dillingham dog it out a little bit. Shannon Jr. a little more complete on the other side, a little bigger, a little more size, but Dillingham just another level of just explosiveness and ability to turn a game on its head. Like I still think Dillingham can jump out to a quick 10-point scoring burst on his own in a way that Terrence Shannon Jr. can't quite match in that regard, but still a guy that I think can contribute to winning. And I could even see him following a little bit of like the Mike Conley style of play in the long run. I think that would be a good guy for him to learn from there. Then at 28, we got Ryan Dunn sliding in there. I've been an anti-Ryan Dunn guy. He ultimately ended up in Phoenix through the trade process here. He's a guy that's a great place for him for starters. I do think that he's going to find a way to impact winning at a high level there. He's not going to have to score basically at all. So I do think it's a good spot for him. I just have some real doubts about like this guy being able to hang at the NBA level. Offensively, it's straight up zero there. Like Matisse Thybulle's been an obvious comparison that has been thrown Ryan Dunn's way. I don't think that's quite fair to him because I think he's more of a dog than Matisse. I think he's more of a real defender than Matisse, that he will bear down and just stick with the guy, pick him up 94 feet, that he's not just going for the steals and blocks. He is like more physically commanding than Matisse as well, a little bit bigger in size and all that. But offensively, like there's just nothing to work with. I believe he attempted under 33-point attempts through 2 years of college. There's nothing offensively. He's going to be used as kind of a screener and roller is probably my guess. And that's kind of the way that they use things. But I think you got to do a wild dance around Ryan Dunn to find a way to make him work. I do think Phoenix is one of the unique places where it has a chance of working because they have so many dynamic scorers and guys that need the ball in their hands. But yeah, I'm out on the Ryan Dunn experience. I'm happy that's not going down in Philadelphia. Also, another comment here from Mr. Crockbot saying, I think it's a great time to shout out King Mariel Shayok, widely overrated but never forgotten. Yeah, there was a point in time where I firmly believed that Marial Shayok was going to end up even better than Shake Milton. Boy, was that wrong. But Shake Milton kind of hit a dead end in his career a little bit as well. I believe he was on that Minnesota team. Then he ended up in New York at the tail end of last year. So hopefully all is good in life of Shake. A good pick at 29 for the Utah Jazz, Isaiah Collier. To me, we knew he was going to be one of the fallers. This was the guy who entered the season as the number one guard in college, was unable to live up to the hype there. I think Utah is a place where he's going to be able to play through his mistakes. Being paired with Keontae George, I think is a really intriguing backcourt partner for him. I'm a believer in Isaiah Collier in the long run. That I still think there's something there with how explosive he is, the way that he can get up and down the court. And I do think that there is credence to that USC was such a mess last year. Like beyond just anything Isaiah Collier, beyond the Bronny James situation, that was a team that felt like they were all discombobulated throughout the entirety of the year. The coach basically had one foot out the door in its entirety. He ultimately left immediately following the season, and no real surprise there. So I think all these USC guys could use just like a new situation. I think Isaiah Collier, he's also a guy who fits the category of his game will translate better college there. And then ultimately, the first round ending up with the Boston Celtics selecting Baylor Shireman with the 30th overall pick. This one sucks. I love Baylor Shireman, and the Celtics just did it again, man. So this is another spot in which they found a way to add a win now talent. I do think while Shireman isn't a player that like changes the ceiling. Obviously, this team just won a championship, so they can't raise it much more than that. I think in the long run, like there will be games in which Shireman can play and contribute to the Celtics team. That's a great pick at 30, and he's a guy who I think there should have been more buzz for being even higher in the draft than that. Even at the beginning of the process, there was talks about Shireman being a second round pick or even undrafted. There was talks of that early on. He really shined during the combine, during the scrimmages. And to the Celtics credit here, Shireman spoke following the selection that he said that they even spoke to him before he even transferred to Creighton, that in his first location, which I'm drawing a blank on what the school was, one of the smaller schools there. So the Celtics have been interested in this guy for several years. So that is good coaching, good scouting. So shout out to the Celtics there. Now we move on to the second round of this year's NBA draft. We're going to start right at the top with the Toronto Raptors. Jonathan Mogbo from San Francisco was the pick there. Don't got a ton on him. I guess to compare him to our guy, Adam Bona, they're pretty similar stylistically. Mogbo, I guess, is looked at as a little bit more of the polish. That isn't a guy that I did a ton of homework on who he is as a player, but wasn't upset to see him go off the board first here. Then we did get finally the stop of the fall of Kyle Filipowski in the 32nd overall pick. As I mentioned, Utah turns out to be the perfect spot for him in more reasons than one. I do think Filipowski is a guy that does have an NBA future. There's enough there to figure out. He's not quite this floor spacing big man that I think the book has been written on him as, that like the numbers just aren't great. Shot 34.9% from three this year, which was far better than his freshman season, but that's still not like floor spacing big man, real deal good. That's just okay. So I need a little bit more from Filipowski. I think the best way to use him is on a team that is going to play some five out, allow him to play make a little bit. I do see a world where he can kill teams off the short roll, be a decision maker and passer in those types of situations, but he's got a lot to work on, and he's just not as good of a rebounder as I would like him to be either. And we even saw those numbers decrease a little bit in year two, which I do not love to be the case. Moving on, though, Tyler Smith going in the third pick to the Milwaukee Bucks. He's an interesting player. I still like Tyler Smith. I'm still net positive on him, but I have some real concerns about his defense. For a guy that is 6'10", athletic, guys just score around him way too easy. And it's one of those more bizarre things to me. There's a little bit of, this is kind of mean, but a little bit of Mo Bamba in him where, like, despite having these long limbs, guys just are able to go around. I saw that in Tyler Smith a lot. Now, there is some high-level athleticism. He's another G League Ignite guy, and I know there's skepticism and, frankly, just a lack of developmental plan that should be the case for a lot of those guys. So I think he was not in a great circumstance for him. We'll be curious if he can get on the right path in Milwaukee. I don't think that's a bad spot for him, and especially when we're seeing guys like Brook Lopez seemingly hit the end of his career and a guy that for the first time is showing signs of slowing down. Tyler Smith could grab that type of spot, as he is a guy that is a legitimate shooter, could find a way. So something to keep an eye on there with Tyler Smith and Milwaukee. To keep it moving a little bit, Tyler Kolek, who found his way to the New York Knicks. Once again, another example of New York Knicks just knowing what they're doing as a franchise. And it is funny to me, all the fake kind of, academic rumors surrounding Tyler Kolek, that there was a report earlier this year about him not being able to read, to the point which Marquette had to send their academic lady to make a statement and say this is not true whatsoever. Also, during the draft last night, shout out to Mark Henry Jr. once again, who at the time of this playing on Fox Sports The Gambler on Saturday morning will be walking down the aisle and getting married. So that's where I will be at as well. But what the thing that he brought to the stream with Tyler Kolek is he mentioned that he scored a 7% on the Wonderlic, which would have been extremely low. That ultimately did prove to be false there, and happy that is the case. My only pushback completely is even if he can't read, he sure can read a pick and roll because that's the number one thing that jumps out. I think Kolek finds a way to stick in the NBA. He's going to be frustrating on the Knicks for years to come. So that is a good spot for him, and I'm not looking forward to suiting up against him there. To keep it going a little bit with the draft process here, Johnny Furphy went number 5 to San Antonio. I like this pick a lot. Furphy, he basically had a 10-game stretch where he set the world on fire, and that was where all of the entirety of his draft stock came. Still 18 years old, another guy way on the young side of the spectrum, another guy who looks way on the young side. He's super bouncy though. He's kind of this big white dude who's really string bean looking, but he can jump out the gym, and it's really intriguing. There is a 3-point jump shot that is enticing there that I do see as being effective. I like Johnny Furphy. I think this is the right kind of setting that a team should take a swing on him. That I do think that San Antonio can bear with them, stick through the growing pains. So that's a really good pick at 35 there. To move on to 36, we're talking about Juan Nunez out of Spain. They're calling him the best pick and roll passer out of the draft, and everyone's excited about him running the pick and roll with Wemby. He ultimately ended up in San Antonio. They just bumped back one spot here. I don't know if I fully see that. Like, I think that he's intriguing. He's played with grown men. That was one of the things that he said in his his post draft interview, that's something that is exciting for him and one of the reasons why he believes in himself. I just don't know if I'm all in on it. We'll see. There are guys who make the transition from Spain pretty easily. That wasn't a name that I got super in depth in either. But shout out to Juan. Shout out to Juan there. So next up, we got my guy Bobby Klintman. I as much as there's the love for Dejan Salon, and Prince Bonito chiming in saying this is the guy that Wemby was excited about, even tweeted about. I believe so. I'm pretty sure. The other thing I'll note here is they talked a lot about like the pick and roll between Wembanyama and Juan Nunez. I don't know if I ever see Wembanyama being like an incredibly high level pick and roll guy. Like he's so skinny that I don't know if you want him taking that amount of beating, and he's also not like a big frame. Like when you think of a good screen and roller, it's like the bigger bodied physical guys. It's the guys that are able to, be difficult to get around. Like Victor Wembanyama, that's not quite him. And yes, the catch radius is insane and you can do that. But I just don't know if I see them, San Antonio, leaning into that much of like a pick and roll type offense. I think if anything, they're going to play a lot more 5 out and that kind of be the style of play around him. That's what my thought process is. But who knows? If Nunez is that electric of a passer, maybe you find a way. Bobby Klintman is a guy that I do like quite a bit. I've brought this up a little bit. I don't think the gap between him and Dejan Salon, who went 6, is really that big. Now, Salon seems to pop better. Teams certainly like him better. Klintman, I started liking 2 years ago at this point when he played for Wake Forest. Went and did a year overseas over there in Sweden, or originally from Sweden. He statistically doesn't really shine in either of those settings. Kind of was a rotational player overseas. He did start for Wake Forest, and like he's very much a toolsy guy who hasn't fully put it together. But I was surprised to see him slip all the way out of the first round completely there. To keep moving a little bit, after Bobby Klintman, we have AJ Mitchell out of UC Santa Barbara, a guard that's a little bit intriguing to me. I don't love his game either. The second round, I'm going to kind of cruise through these because I do think these are a bit of guys that are a crapshoot. I'll stop a little more in depth on these next few. Jalen Wells, who I love, a guy that I just see as a catch and shooter. Another cool kind of trajectory to get to the NBA level that he did spend. I believe it was 2 years at a JUCO college, then jumped to Washington State, shot the lights out, and all of a sudden he's an NBA player. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool the way that life works for things like that. When you're thinking that you're sitting there going to community college thinking there's no future, and all of a sudden you just keep hooping, keep believing, and you find a way to get the job done there. So shout out to Jalen Wells. I will be rooting for him. Talking about the next guy, we got Oso Iguodaro, who I love. Out of Marquette, one of the highest IQ players in this entire draft. I do wish he was a little bit better shooter or a little bigger, but the bottom line is that dude is so smart and has enough supplementary skills as a playmaker, a guy that can distribute, can just impact winning. You can switch him on the perimeter as a defender. I love Oso Iguodaro, so I will be rooting for him quite a bit. And then we get to our guy, Adam Bona, at pick 41. Kind of said my bullet points about him, that he is all effort. He is B-ball Paul 2.0. He is a guy that is going to just leave everything that he has out on the floor. And I know I mentioned this a little bit already, But it does feel like the Sixers are intentionally leaning into these good character, hardworking guys. That's how you set culture, and that is a good thing. In the long run, it takes some time to establish, but I think that's an area that has been overlooked for a lot of these players, and I'm excited to see them coming back in that direction there. I don't love the Bona pick. Again, as I mentioned, my straight up decision here would have been to draft Justin Edwards, but they landed him as an undrafted free agent. So can't complain too much. And I do want to talk about him in a little bit. We're going to kind of speed through the rest of these here. We saw KJ Simpson go 42 to Charlotte. I do love that pick. I think that's a really good pick. He's a guy who really shined at Colorado, a nasty defender. He'll be up in your face. He'll be physical. And another guy that really shined at the combine there. We had Nikola Jurzik go next. Pell Larson after that. Jamal Shed from Houston, the guy that's the heart and soul of that Houston team. Like Jamal Shed quite a bit. Happy to see him hear his name called because I did think there was a world where he did not get drafted whatsoever. Then as things continue, Cam Christie at the 46th pick, brother of Max Christie. And kind of cool that this is the case. He got drafted to the Clippers there. So his brother, of course, Max Christie, playing for the Lakers. So kind of a cross-court family there. Max Christie for the Lakers and Cam Christie for the Clippers is going to be a cool little storyline there. I'm sure there will be quite the experience or conversation and talking points when those matchups do occur. Shout out to Antonio Reeves, pick number 47, for getting on the board here. I expected him to go undrafted, and he was a guy I kind of had circled as a guy that I don't think deserved to go undrafted really throughout. He was a 20-point-per-game scorer for that Kentucky team, and with Reed Sheppard and with Rob Dillingham, who were each top 8 picks, Antonio Reeves looked like he held his own just with those guys from start to finish this year. And as much as John Calipari has gotten this criticism of just relying on the one-and-done talents, this is what he did with Antonio Reeves. He did bring in an older guy, bring in a guy to set the culture, set the standard. And I thought he did a nice job setting the table for those guys. So I like Antonio Reeves. I don't know if I think he's an NBA player. I am a little skeptical from a skill set standpoint, but he's just a guy that I enjoy as a basketball player. So I'm happy to at least see him get an opportunity. 2 guys that I do think are going to stick were the next 2 picks. Harrison Ingram out of North Carolina to the Spurs, I think is absolutely an NBA player. He only measured in at like 6'5" at the combine, which is kind of surprising considering he was close to a 10 rebound per game guy all throughout college. Just plays winning basketball and did it North Carolina. Transferred into there. I believe he went to Stanford beforehand. Can shoot the ball really well. Is switchable on the perimeter. Just a guy that plays the game the right way. I like Harrison Ingram. I'm happy to see him. I think he even could have gone a fringe first-round pick type talent is who he is. And the next guy that I also do think just sticks is Tristan Newton. There's not a ton that stands out in Tristan Newton's game. He's just another guy who's a straight up good basketball player. We're kind of at the category of players where these are all guys that were just great college players that teams are taking a chance on. But Tristan Newton, I think, fits the bill that he's going to find a way to stick at the NBA level. He is a guy that is a winner. He absolutely is. So shout out to Tristan Newton. I think Indiana's a pretty good spot for him there, or he might have been traded, I believe, actually. But Tristan Newton, a guy that I do think sticks. Indiana then did take Enrique Freeman. Not a ton on him on the kid out of Akron. From there, we went Melvin Ajinka, Quentin Post out of Boston College, who's an intriguing guy, can shoot the lights out as a big man. Cam Spencer, who I love out of UConn at 53. Anton Watson at 54. Then at 55, we get man of the hour, Bronny James. And I do want to have the Bronny James conversation a little bit here. I mean, for starters, like, it's very cool that Bronny James is playing with his father at the NBA level. I got to get that out of the way and preface it with that. There's no doubt about that. But with that being said, I can't help but just feel like icky in this whole process of how things going out. To call a spade here, Bronny James is just not an NBA player. I just talked about what a mess that USC team when speaking about Isaiah Collier. Well, on that mess of a USC team, which, by the way, ended up below 500 and did not qualify for the NCAA tournament, Bronny James was 6th in minutes per game. The dude averaged 5 points per game, shot below 30% from 3. Just not an NBA player right now. And in fairness to the guy, like, he had some real deal heart issues. I'm not saying he'll never be NBA ready. He's just not right now. And my fear and frustration is with Bronny James specifically is I really do question how often decisions are made based on what's best for Bronny James. I think there's decisions based on what's best for LeBron. I think there's decisions made on what's best for Clutch Sports. But I just want to grab Bronny James, shake him, and say, like, dude, what do you want right now? And particularly what frustrated me about that is Rich Paul went on Gil's Arenas, which is a podcast with Gilbert Arenas, and then spoke about, he asked Bronny James, what do you want? And what Bronny James, or at least what Rich Paul shared on that podcast, is that Bronny said, I just want to hear my name called. And what did Rich Paul do from that point on? He threatened that if a team drafts Bronny James, not named the Los Angeles Lakers, Bronny's playing in Australia. And while I was sitting there begging for a team to call his bluff because I just wanted to see it, ultimately he ended up with the Lakers at 55. And I also do think it's a little funny that those conversations, like as I mentioned, I just straight up don't think the guy's an NBA player. I think those conversations between Rich Paul and a team probably went a little something like, hey, this is Rich Paul. Don't you dare draft Bronny James. And the NBA GM going, oh, yeah, like we weren't even thinking about it. He wasn't even close to our radar. So I do think that, like, maybe it was a little bit funny, but ultimately the bottom line is he didn't end up on the Los Angeles Lakers as the case. And Prince chiming in saying, yeah, what's up all these reports saying Rich telling teams not to draft in or he's going to Australia. I do think it's crazy. I would have loved to have seen a team call his bluff, but ultimately Bronny gets his wishes. Clutch Sports continues to be one of the most powerful agencies in all of sports. I think Rich Paul is the most powerful probably person in the NBA, and kind of sad and crazy that that is the case. I do think Rich Paul gets it twisted way too often, that he works for the players, not the other way around. And that's kind of another comment towards Bronny James there. But to round out the rest of this draft, we did get a nice pick that I liked in Kevin McCullough Jr. at 56 beyond Bronny James there. Also, the last two picks, Ulrich Chambachi is, I believe, how you say his name, out of Cameroon. Pretty cool, this selection here. This is the first player to ever be selected from the NBA Africa program. So he is a guy that was found at one of these camps over here. Pretty cool to just see, like, that's a pathway that is being developed. More so than ever this year, we saw the influence of international prospects. I don't think that's going anywhere. There we saw 3 of the first 6 picks coming from France. I believe we saw more than half of the draft being international prospects. Very interesting. And for everyone here in America, that should be a wake-up call, is it does feel like they have it down to a science overseas for developing talent and having the pathway to get these guys ready to be professionals. And we're seeing more of these pathways in America just kind of disintegrate. The G League Ignite are shutting down. Teams like Overtime Elite, is that translating in the same way? Like, it feels like there has been a big swing in favor of international talent, and that's something that I think everyone in America in the basketball world should be recognizing a little bit. Obviously, we want the best talent. This is no shade to those guys. This is very much a comment about we need to figure out what the pathway is to develop players at the same rate as these other guys. We've seen sports like soccer where America has been lapped in their development programs. Basketball cannot afford for that to be the same way. So let's iron out what these AAU pathways are and everything else. And then the final pick of the NBA drafts comes out of Germany, another international prospect there, that being Ariel Hukporti going to the Dallas Mavericks. So that'll do it for our draft recap there. We're going to take a quick break for the radio viewers here. On the other side, I'm going to talk all about the Sixers and what I think on their draft pick. So stay tuned for that. I'll be back right here. And welcome back on the other side here. So we just did a draft recap for picks 1 through 58. Of course, there were 2 picks forfeited, one of them coming from the Sixers, which I believe still oriented from the Daniel House and PJ Tucker tampering situation, which is probably 2 of the worst players to ever tamper for in NBA history. So got to do better than that. But for the Sixers, I do hope they're tampering right now and not getting caught for it, because there still needs to be some bigger moves that must be done around the edges to complete this team. I do want to see it for the Sixers team, but for now, let's acknowledge and talk about what they did on draft night. So as far as my grades overall, I'll start with Jared McCain. I know I touched on him a decent bit in the first place. I give that a B+ move. That I think this is a nice, safe choice for what your goals are for the future, whether this is trade him for a future pick, whether this is something where he can grow as a long-term piece of the puzzle there. I like Jared McCain. I think he can play with Tyrese Maxey far more than people are giving him credit. I think he's a better defender than people are giving him credit, and I'm excited to see what he brings to this organization. The Adam Bona pick, I'll go C+ there. That I do like it. I do see it. I do understand the vision and the thought process behind it. I just think there were better options on the board. And while I'm far happier with using a second round pick to add a backup center than would have been the case if they had taken that swing at 16 there, still a little skeptical if this dude is that much better than Paul Reed or really an equal stepping stone. So I will have my eyes all over him in Summer League to watch a little bit more in depth. There are some really positive indicators and some concerning as well. I do think he's a high-level shot blocker. I do see the athleticism. He does foul too much. There's a lot of other stuff to break down as well. But Adam Bona was the pick at 41. The guy that I really want to talk especially in depth on is Justin Edwards. This is the slam dunk to me. This is the one that I'm extremely excited about. So to speak about Justin Edwards as a whole, he entered the season as the number one recruit on Kentucky, the number three recruit in the country, a guy that seemed to have a red carpet paved to be a top 10 pick in this year's NBA draft. A borderline number one pick was a large part of the talking point. Measured in around 6'6", 6'7", got a 6'10" wingspan. He looks the part of an NBA player. Now, during his time in Kentucky, he was outshined by some other prospects. And with John Calipari, which it was his last year at Kentucky last year, a bit of the thought process behind things is that he basically brings in these high level of talent and lets them dog it out. The cream will rise to the top for who these best players are. And then ultimately did not end up being Justin Edwards. Now, when I think about Justin Edwards, he's got some things to clean up, that he needs to improve on his right hand. He's very lefty dependent. He does have that left-handed jump shot. He's a guy who's more comfortable driving left. I was reading a little bit of his tendencies, where it seems like every time that he drives right, he attempts to spin back and go to that left hand. Those are things that do need to be fixed at the NBA level. I think even there's a pretty likely world where the best route for his development is to let him get seasoned up in the G League a little bit. But he just looks the part of an NBA player. And I do think that there should be some real soul searching and reflection here. I think he has had some bad advice for his management. I think there could be a world where he goes back to college for a year, and all of a sudden we are talking about him as a very high level draft pick. As far as a couple questions here, Prince saying, how's his work ethic? I don't know anything of certainty here. I will say I tried to watch this guy in person a couple times. I even went to a game in which he was a late scratch for, that there was an injury that popped up that where it didn't get through to me, that I saw him sitting on the bench, watched Emotep Charter play, but Justin Edwards was not a part of that team. So not a great sign there. I'll say this, I think it's fair to have some skepticism and concerns there. I haven't heard anything concrete to believe it, but my spidey senses are a little bit in question for where the work ethic is at or what level it is. But I don't want to say anything about it unless I knew that to be the case. Maybe this is the wake-up call that he needs as well, because we see that from guys where, he seemed to have his path paved, that we saw the outlook, he put in the work, he was in the right spot to climb into the NBA prospect that he believed himself to be, and that didn't quite play itself out. So maybe that is the wake-up call to get back in the gym and figure things out. I still think he has every single tool that you look for as a guy like an NBA player there. And yes, this is Edwards' work ethic that I am speaking about here. I don't know anything to be the case that it's bad. I do think that more identity as a basketball player is probably my concern. That I think there does have to be some reflection and drop the superstar hope and figure out how can I carve out a role for myself. The wide majority of NBA players are players that have their role, whether this is a 3-and-D guy, whether this is a guy that is a defense first guy. There is a place for Justin Edwards, but you got to figure out how you can impact winning in a major way. But more on, I guess, the theoretical approach here is I just love it from Daryl Morey's part that you're taking this type of upside swing on a guy who could end up in a weak class, end up being one of the top 30 players overall. That is absolutely a possibility with the caliber of talent that Justin Edwards is. And I do think stylistically, his game translates far better at the NBA level. And by the way, it's not like it was all bad at Kentucky. It's not like he stunk it up and couldn't play whatsoever. He just was a guy that was outshined by the Rob Dillinghams, the Reed Shepherds of the world, that we still saw some moments where Justin Edwards shined. The Alabama game is the number one that jumps out. Had over 20 points in that game, shot 10 for 10 from the floor, 7 for 7 from three. I'm a believer in the jump shot. That's not something that I'm super concerned about. I saw that they also added 2 other guys, one on Exhibit 10 and another on a 2-way contract. Those aren't guys I'm as excited about. I'll dive in a little bit deeper than them in the future tense, or at another point, I'll dive into deeper on what they can bring. I am excited. I will be popping out to Las Vegas for NBA Summer League this year, so we'll get a chance to take it in from in person and hopefully get some interviews with these guys. I'm particularly interested to talk to Jared McCain and get a little feel about all that. I do want to talk to Justin Edwards too, get a feel for where is his mentals at. How does it feel to be a guy that seemed to have the red carpet laid, and all of a sudden you're looking down the barrel of an undrafted free agent situation? And I know I did hint at this earlier, but I think there's a pretty likely world in which Justin Edwards is a guy that probably said he doesn't want to be a second-round pick, but I think his agent probably made that choice for all the talk about Rich Paul. That is a very common move where when you're an undrafted guy, you can have your choice for what team you go to, versus if you are a second-round pick, you're stuck with whatever team drafts you. And while sometimes that works out, as clearly there's interest in that team, it also can backfire if you go to not that great of a situation. So regardless, I'm very happy that he is in Philadelphia. I do think the Sixers are an ideal location for him, as it is local, as there is opportunity for him to outperform his slot there. And ultimately, the Sixers should benefit from bringing in that high level of talent there. So shout out to Justin Edwards. Welcome to Phil, or welcome home. Welcome to stick around in Philadelphia. Very excited about that. That was probably the number one home run swing. I think I'll give that an A+. I'll give Jared McCain a B+, and I'll give Adam Bona a C+ there. So overall, not too bad there. And Prince chiming in saying, so perhaps Rich thought this was a good fit. Should be interesting. Yeah, should be interesting there. And as far as the good fit beyond just like the basketball talking points, I think it's more about like the contractual opportunity. And he signed a two-way right away. That's the contract that he is on. And there's a real chance that as Daryl Morey looks to fill out the rest of this roster, I know we're still having these talking points with the Brandon Ingrams of the world, with the other players, the Kentavious Caldwell-Pope that I do think get brought in. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in the future. In a couple of seconds here. But beyond that, like, it's just Joel Embiid, it's Jared McCain, it's maybe Paul Reed, and I think that's trending towards no, as his contract is non-guaranteed, and I just took Adam Bona there. It's Ricky Council IV, who I do want him still around, but also on a non-guaranteed. Jeff Dowden, who's on a team option. I could go either direction there. And that's it for the roster right now. Tyrese Maxey will get his max and be a part of this team as well. But if Justin Edwards looks phenomenal in Summer League and looks NBA ready, why not give him a standard deal? So I think Edwards looks at it that way. The agency looks at it that way, and the Sixers certainly will too, as well. So free agency is set to officially begin on Monday, July 1st. So things are going to get pretty crazy from here. To speak a little bit more about that from the Sixers angle here, they got about $60 million in cap space. They got money to be spent here. And also for the record here, any thoughts on Flowers? I believe he got picked up. I forget who I saw that he went to. I do like him. I would even rank Justin Edwards higher. I'll say that Edwards is at the top of my list, but certainly wouldn't have any. Trenton Flowers, I believe who you're referring to there, would have had no issue. I think he's an intriguing prospect as well. Another toolsy guy who I think could put it together, but Edwards was certainly my preference there. Now, as far as the Sixers overall, about $60 million in cap space, and don't be panicked when we're inching along in Tyrese Maxey's max contract has not been signed yet, that he's going to earn every single penny or be given every single penny that he has earned to this point. That is coming, but in the order of operations, it has to happen last. And the reason for that being that he's got a $13 million cap hit right now. Don't forget, this guy was the 21st overall pick. So that's kind of the numbers that these are based off. So he has that $13 million cap hit. The Sixers will accept that. That's the number that will go on the salary cap. And then they will give Maxey his huge bag after that other $60 million is given out to the rest of the free agents there. So Kentavious Caldwell-Pope is a name that has been floated around here. We know who KCP is. Two-time champion, one with the Lakers, one with the Nuggets, a guy that is that true 3-and-D type archetype, a true one, not a guy that we're kind of talking into that role. I do think he's a guy who can contribute on just about any winning team. I do think KCP is a guy who still has more in the tank at this point, over 40% shooter last year, played pretty well. And what's specifically interesting on this overall is their Sixers, if they miss out on these big ticket free agent type guys, they could take a half step into a little bit of the Bruce Brown approach. And what I mean by that is when you flash back to this time last year, what the Indiana Pacers did is they gave Bruce Brown significantly more money than he's probably worth. They gave him $20 million with a $25 million team option. And by the way, the Raptors are going to accept that $25 million team option and try to trade him from there. Still currently a member of the Toronto Raptors and played for them for the second half of last season. He's a guy that needs to be moved. There's pretty much no doubt about it. But I think Kentavious Caldwell-Pope could be following a similar pathway here. That we're talking about, this is a guy who could be given one of those deals. It's already been rumored that the Magic are attached to it. Klay Thompson being mentioned in similar conversations. Obviously, Paul George is like the prize that would be ideal. But I'm honestly, everything is pointing to him staying in Los Angeles at this point, unless we have any reason to believe otherwise. I think we got to accept that as the reality. So it's unfortunate, but you can't make this guy want to move all the way across the country. And I think that's more of the issue than anything basketball related to this point. But you still got to find a way to spend that money and improve this Sixers team, and that's where Kentavious Caldwell-Pope comes into play. So we get it from a skill set standpoint that he could be another shooter surrounding Joel Embiid. That's kind of the on-court talking points. He is a guy that is a winner, a guy that is a defender, guy that's high IQ, makes the right reads, is in the right place, all these things. But on the larger scale, the talking points in the conversation here is that Kentavious Caldwell-Pope could be a guy that is a trade chip to get them to that true superstar. And to use this same Bruce Brown example, look at that was the key piece that made this Pascal Siakam trade go. And no, it wasn't. They needed to get Bruce Brown in return. The Raptors wanted him that bad. But what it was about is you need that $25 million that is attached to his contract to make it work under the CBA. If you give Kentavious Caldwell-Pope that level of contract, then all of a sudden, when the next Donovan Mitchell or Kevin Durant or Jimmy Butler or whatever unhappy star pops up available, you have a guy that can be the starting point from a salary perspective to trade. And it doesn't hurt if he's here. Like if Kentavious Caldwell-Pope ends up just playing the entirety of the contract with the Sixers, it's not the worst thing in the world. That you do know that he's still a positive basketball player. So that's kind of a direction I could see the Sixers going. The way that it works in my mind, I guess, to paint the most positive, that I do think when we look at the Sixers wish list, I think LeBron completely off the list now that Bronny is now in LA. Paul George pretty much completely off the list unless there's a pretty significant change of heart. Jimmy Butler, I don't see it happening. But I do think he's going to play at least this season in Miami. He will have a player option at the tail end of this year. That the contract extension talks have completely quieted on that end, but I don't see him moving at this point. The options are getting slimmer and slimmer. Kevin Durant, not going anywhere. Devin Booker, not going anywhere. Donovan Mitchell, about to sign an extension. All eyes in my mind are pointing towards Brandon Ingram. And I do think there's a world where I've heard 2 first-round picks has been the going rate for Brandon Ingram. I would pay that in a heartbeat. I'm totally okay with that. Now, the other talking point from the Brandon Ingram standpoint and why that number is what it is you got to pay the man as well. That he will be going into the last year of his contract, and that's really why the Pelicans are motivated to move him. That there are some concerns with, like, is this guy that level of max? He's not Tobias Harris, is my pushback here. He's not a guy that is afraid. He can attack off the dribble far better than I ever saw from Tobias Harris. He's a guy who plays with a little bit more just like grunt and mentality, and you feel him throughout the course of the game far more than Tobias Harris. But there are some other concerns there, that he is too mid-range dependent. And specifically, like, I've seen the pushback on, obviously he's not an ideal fit with Zion Williamson, with some of these other players. But for Brandon Ingram specifically here, like, you playing with Zion, it's crystal clear that what needs to be done to optimize this team is you shoot more threes. You need to space this floor. And the exact opposite happened, that his three-point attempts went down during his time in New Orleans. And I get it. I know there's Trey Murphy. I know there's CJ McCollum. I know there's other excuses here. But the reality is Ingram got more determined to get to his spots on the floor, which is a way that I just don't love that. And particularly with a guy named Joel Embiid right here, that is very important to me. That spacing is the name of the game. So I do have some concerns there, but I still think it is worth taking a swing on Ingram because the Sixers team still needs to find a way to get true wings. Even if Ingram isn't perfect, he's got a chance to match up with the Mikal Bridges and, the Jaylen Browns and Jason Tatums. He's not these guys, but he's at least in the vicinity. I do think he's better than Mikal Bridges, but I don't think people are ready for that conversation there. We got Brian Pumper chiming back in saying BI takes contested mid-ranges and PG takes contested threes. One is way younger, though. Yeah, both fair critiques there, and that is the appeal with Ingram, that at least, like, the window remains open. Now, that's the biggest downside of Paul George, on top of, like, some of the mentality concerns that certainly seem to be more and more relevant. Some of the quotes that I just haven't dug coming out of Paul George's mouth completely here. But beyond just that, he's 34 years old. That this would be the 2 or 3 year push to win a championship, and then the Sixers have to answer some tough questions about what the future is. With Brandon Ingram, at least that door is open for longer. That he is 27. He is a guy that could potentially continue growing, getting better, that he should be entering his prime right now. And you do have that link between Tyrese Maxey, Brandon Ingram, and Joel Embiid. And the reason that I say that's interesting there is right now it's clear Joel Embiid's still the alpha on this team. That Tyrese Maxey, the number 2, Brandon Ingram, the number 3. That there's no doubt about that specifically for kind of a pecking order. Maybe Ingram can give a run for his money, but I frankly just don't see it. But what I do think that there is a world where is that power balance begins to shift as Joel Embiid truly eclipses in the later years of his career. I know he's 30 right now. He's not getting any younger, but I see a world where Maxey becomes a little bit more of the number 1 scoring option and Joel Embiid becomes more impactful on a defensive and rebounding standpoint. I think that's still a recipe for success, or could be for the Sixers team. And that is only possible if you have additional years with a player like Brandon Ingram. Now, in an ideal world, we could be talking about a Mikal Bridges, or a guy who has even more on him, or I'm more confident can grow than I truly feel about Brandon Ingram. But I can tell you it's not going to happen with Paul George, who is exactly who he is. And that guy is still a very good basketball player. But I don't know if we're actually looking at the best route to win a championship. That's a lot of eggs that have to be put in a very small basket, and one that is over quite quickly. So we'll see what happens from here. The Sixers have to find a way to get a job done, but it does feel like Brandon Ingram is just about their only option. Now, another positive to Brandon Ingram, $36 million cap hit. So what does that mean exactly here? Is that you can still bring in Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. That is no issue here. You can bring in, that is your move. If we're starting to talk about Tyrese Maxey, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Brandon Ingram, Nico Batum / Kelly Oubre, Joel Embiid, and Jared McCain off the bench. We're getting somewhere. Now, is that team better than the Knicks and the Celtics? No, I don't think it is, unfortunately. I still think you got a ways to go. But Joel Embiid is the great equalizer here. That really the true gamble, if the Sixers are ever going to win a championship, is you need this guy to be healthy in the postseason. We've yet to see it. It didn't happen last year. It hasn't happened any of the other years that I want to run through, but that is the gamble. That as much as we want to have these conversations, these talking points about all the surrounding pieces, the only way this works from the Sixers end is if you get a healthy Joel Embiid run. And that the calculus, the chances, none of this changes regarding who the complementary pieces are. So for the Sixers, you have to keep plugging through and trying things. If you get a healthy Joel Embiid with these types of pieces around him, they got a puncher's chance because Joel Embiid is going to be the best player on the floor regardless of who these other teams are, even with Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Jalen Brunson, any other J name you want to throw my way, it's still going to be Joel Embiid. And Prince chiming in saying facts, year 4 to 5 Maxey, different type of confidence. All-star Maxey, team leader Maxey, summer workout mixtapes Maxey. Sign me up for all of them because that's how good this kid is. I do think that there's going to be another step forward with Tyrese Maxey. And I do think the Jared McCain and Tyrese Maxey backcourt is going to be far more fun than people are giving it credit. For the concerns, for the people who don't think it will work, I hear you. One of the bigger storylines that I think is relevant to note here, Tyrese Maxey turned himself into at least a decent defender last year. That we saw him being passable on the defensive end, and that is huge for me moving forward. That I do think that opens up a ton of doors from a roster construction standpoint of you can run offenses where Tyrese Maxey is the worst defender on the floor. That can be really good, defenses. You can run teams where Maxey's the worst defender on the floor and you can clamp up guys. Like I saw stretches last year where Tyrese Maxey was taking Jaylen Brown's lunch money. That's how good he was for periods of time. And I don't know if he's ever going to be a defensive stopper. In fact, I think it's more likely than not that he won't be that way. But the fact that he's at least passable is really important to this team. And on the other side of things, it allows you to take gambles like taking a guy like Jared McCain. And to give a little credit to Mark Henry Jr. here, he constantly says this one. When you look back at how these Sixers got bounced out of playoffs in past years, it's never been the defense. It's always been not having these other scoring options. And if we're laying out a lineup with Tyrese Maxey, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Brandon Ingram, Kelly Oubre, and Joel Embiid, or Jared McCain, we got some other ways to score than has ever been the case. So that does, to me, feel like the most realistic route that the Sixers are shaping up to. But who knows? Maybe Daryl Morey's got something else up his sleeve that I do know. His quote after the draft or after round 1 last night, talking about we plan on being the best team in the Eastern Conference. Well, if that is the case, then it's time to get cooking because right now other teams are getting better and the Sixers have not. Now, I don't want to be too hard on Daryl as free agency does not open until Monday. That will be when things truly stir up. I do want to hear what the Paul George resolution is. I also am kind of out on the sign and trade idea for Paul George. I get the concept. I certainly make sense from the Los Angeles standpoint. But if that's the case, the biggest selling point and appeal to Paul George to me was that you could bring this guy in without giving up any assets. If we're now talking about having to trade for him and then give him this max deal, yeah, I'm out on that one. I don't want to put all the eggs in that Paul George size basket because I just see it backfiring just about on every single outcome there. So unfortunately, I don't see that playing out to be the case, but who knows where things go from here. But let me know what you guys think if you have any other comments. That is going to wrap things up here for this live streaming episode / episode of the Tough Cover Radio Show, filling in for Mark Henry Jr. on Saturday mornings. Appreciate each and every one of you guys for hanging me. Wherever you are watching, make sure you are smashing that subscribe button, whether it is PickSwap Media, the Fox Sports The Gambler YouTube channel, which it is also streaming on, or if you're listening to us on the iHeartRadio app, make sure you let us know you're listening. Get involved in socials at Fox PHL Gambler on all platforms there. Appreciate you guys for hanging out with me from start to finish today. A ton about to go down in the NBA world, so I will be at the heart of it, breaking it all down from start to finish. Once again, my name is Sean Barnard. Appreciate each of you guys once again. Keep it locked on the dial and talk to you next time right here on PickSwap Media / Fox Sports The Gambler. Peace.